Power doesn't always reveal itself in loud moves. Sometimes it reveals itself in the quiet moments, when someone finally lays out the pieces no one bothered to line up before. And that's what happened the moment Senator Whitehouse walked through Patel's record in full view of the country. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. It was methodical, almost surgical. The way he connected the threats, the Fifth Amendment refusals, the judgment failures, the off-the-record warnings from Patel's own colleagues, and the strange decisions no one could quite explain. And as the picture sharpened, you could feel the entire room lean in.
Investigation of those crimes. And indeed, in every case that I'm aware of in which those cases were allowed to go to judgment, the president was convicted. So we can't allow the weaponization narrative to just remove the notion that the guy was investigated and prosecuted for crimes because he did the crimes. Once you start with the notion that Trump is not a criminal but a victim, you then have to invent the conspiracy that victimized him. And once you've propagated that conspiracy, you then have to find who the conspirators are. So then you have to go after FBI agents and DOJ folks in order to prop up that theory. The way that ended in Soviet Russia was with show trials of the individuals who were allegedly in the conspiracy. The way that ends in Trump's America is with agents and prosecutors forced out in mass purges that may well, as the Ranking Member Durbin has pointed out, been driven by Kash Patel as a private citizen. So starting with that point, there are three reasons why Kash Patel is extremely dangerous. One is all of his wild MAGA behavior. This is a guy whose judgment is beyond questionable. It's appallingly bad. We have a lot of quarrel about whether his enemies list is an enemies list and whether we're smearing the guy by saying that his enemies list is an enemies list. Here's what he said about it. He showed his enemies list and said, "The manhunt starts tomorrow." If they're not your enemies, why would you start a manhunt against them? He called them the criminals themselves and showed a picture of his enemies list. If criminals aren't your enemies, as head of the FBI, who are? He retweeted a video showing him chainsawing the heads off of people on his enemies list. If you're chainsawing the heads off of people, are they not your enemies? So the invention that this is not an enemies list requires people to go into just fantasy land. And these are his own statements. These aren't our accusations. These are Patel's own words. Going after people in the media, impeaching judges who disagree with us, shutting down the FBI Hoover building, on and on and on. This guy is a flagrant extremist with appallingly bad judgment. Second point, we don't know enough about this mischief yet. There are real open questions. We've never in this committee had a person come for a serious senior law enforcement position who had testified in a grand jury criminal matter, and we don't know what he testified about. He's entitled to tell us. That's basic grand jury Rule 6E law. But this side of the committee is completely covering that up. We have absolutely we're entitled to know. We've never had somebody come through this committee for a high senior law enforcement position who had pled the Fifth. He's got the right to do that, of course. We've got the right to know. And by the way, when he exercises the right to do that in a civil proceeding, that entitles the jury to draw the adverse inference that what he is covering up in the civil proceeding with his Fifth Amendment assertion is against his interests. A judge will instruct a jury about that adverse interest, and we're not supposed to draw an adverse interest in this committee when we're not told about his Fifth Amendment assertion. There's all this weird stuff that's come up since about investments in Chinese companies in the Cayman Islands vesting while he will be FBI director. If the guy is supposed to be investigating Chinese intrusion into our intelligence faculties, if we're trying to investigate Chinese fentanyl trafficking into our country, why do we want an FBI director who is somewhere between $1 and $5 million into a Chinese company through a Cayman Islands shell? And then there are the Russia connections. I'll get to those at the end. We don't have to, where everybody's fond of saying these are Democratic smears. Actually, go to the Trump appointees who worked with this guy. What are they warning us? They're warning us, Trump National Security Advisor John Bolton. I didn't think he was qualified. I was forced to hire him. That's some recommendation from a colleague. His deputy, Charles Kupperman. Patel's ideas are ludicrous. He's absolutely unqualified for this job, untrustworthy, an absolute disgrace to even consider an individual of this nature. Definitely you want that on your resume by way of a recommendation from a former supervisor. Attorney General Barr said Patel has virtually no experience that would qualify him to be the deputy director of the FBI, and now he's back as the director of the FBI. And Trump's CIA director, Gina Haspel, threatened to resign rather than allow this guy into her office as her deputy. And if you go beyond the Trump appointees who are warning us about this guy, you can go to the last time he testified in court, which was in Colorado, and here's what the court found about him. That Patel was not a credible witness, that his testimony was illogical, and it was completely devoid of any evidence in the record. Okay, I've been an attorney general, and I've been a United States attorney, and I've put state police troopers on the stand, and I've put FBI agents on the stand. If at the end of a case, a judge made findings like this about a law enforcement witness that I put on the stand, there would be follow-up. I would want an explanation of why this witness was so incredible that findings like that were made by the judge. It would be a significant issue with respect to that witness's continued performance in office. And here's a guy who's been found to be completely incredible by a judge in his testimony, and we're acting as if that's nothing. That's not Democrats. That's a judge in Colorado. So the last thing I'll say is I think we need to begin to prepare ourselves for Trump-Russia 2.0. The Trump-Russia thing was, I'm not going to go back all over it, fully ventilated in the Senate Bipartisan Intelligence Report, in the Mueller report. Trump-Russia was a thing. We stopped talking about it, but Trump kept talking about it and saying it was a hoax. Trump-Russia hoax, Trump-Russia hoax. No, it was not a hoax. It was real. It was there. There's a record. Part of it was bipartisan work. Some of it was done in the House. There was an abundance of evidence about the Trump-Russia connection. And now what are we seeing? We're seeing Patel coming in, who says he wants to wreck the FBI's what he called intel shop, which is the part of the FBI that looks at Russia and does counterintelligence work against Russia. He said that he wants to close out the D.C. office and send everybody out into the field. Well, it's the D.C. office, not the field offices, that do the counterintelligence work. You want to shut it down? You're opening your arms to Russian intelligence operations. You go just across to the Attorney General's office, and there's Attorney General Bondi. What's the first thing she does when she gets in? Closes all the kleptocrature and kleptocracy investigation offices of the Department of Justice. Gee, who were they pursuing? Putin and his oligarchs. You shut down the group that has successfully grabbed assets off Putin's crooked oligarchs. What a signal that is. And then look at Tulsi Gabbard. I'm not going to go through the whole length of her Russia associations, but let's just say that a Russian news media editorial said that her appointment should cause the CIA and the FBI to tremble because she was a friend to Russia. Who defends us against Russian intelligence operations and Russia's criminal operations in the United States. It's the FBI, it's the Department of Justice, and it's our intelligence community. The people in charge of each one have sent powerful signals that they are shutting down our defenses when it comes to Russia. And we're about to head to the Munich Security Conference, where we are seeing Mr. Art of the Deal and his operatives giving away every piece of leverage that we have over Putin with respect to Ukraine. It is unilateral disarmament to throw Ukraine under the bus and give Putin what he wants. So mark my words. This Patel guy will come back to haunt you. Every piece of evidence shows that, and it is not Democrat evidence, it's his own word.
Because when all those pieces sit together on the same table, it becomes nearly impossible to imagine this man taking control of the nation's top investigative force. And the most unsettling part? None of this came from rumors. None from partisan spin. It all came from Patel himself, his colleagues, and official findings. But as striking as that moment was, the story only gets more revealing from here. The senator didn't open with insults or fire. He started by dismantling the foundation of a narrative that has been thrown around for years, the claim that past investigations were politicized. And he didn't do it with emotion. He did it with facts. He reminded everyone watching that investigations begin where evidence exists and end where courts decide. He pointed out that every time a case involving the former president actually made it to judgment, courts delivered the same outcome. Guilty, proven, verified, not because of politics, but because of evidence examined under the rules of law. That was his first point. If wrongdoing happened, the consequences weren't manufactured, they were earned. And once that truth is ignored, once the wrongdoing is erased, the only way to explain the consequences is to invent conspiracies that paint powerful officials as villains. And those conspiracies need faces. They need targets. They need people inside institutions to be blamed for doing their jobs. That's how purges start. And that's exactly where Patel becomes central to this story. But the senator didn't stay in the theoretical. He moved directly to Patel's own behavior no one had fully lined up in public until that moment. The posts, the statements, the threats, the so-called enemy list. These weren't accusations he was reading from an opposing party. These were Patel's own public words and images. One moment in particular froze the room. Patel displaying his list and saying the hunt begins tomorrow. If they weren't enemies, why call it a hunt? Why use language of pursuit? Why frame political disagreement as something to track down? Then came the video he reposted. A clip portraying symbolic harm toward those on that list. Imagery far beyond anything acceptable for someone vying to lead an agency built on impartiality and restraint. Whitehouse didn't exaggerate. He didn't embellish. He simply described what Patel had already broadcast. And what he described was deeply inconsistent with the discipline required for an FBI director. But as troubling as that public behavior was, it was still only the opening act of his warning. What came next was unprecedented. Patel's invocation of the Fifth Amendment in a matter tied to his grand jury testimony. Legally, Patel had every right to assert it. But politically, professionally, historically, no nominee for this position had ever come before the committee with that kind of cloud hanging over them. The senator pointed out something that most of the public never hears. The secrecy of grand jury proceedings does not prevent Patel himself from telling the committee what he testified about. The law protects the institution, not the witness. That means Patel could clear everything up instantly. But instead, he chose silence. And silence doesn't always mean guilt, but it always means risk. When someone hopes to lead federal law enforcement, yet refuses to explain prior testimony that could expose them to legal consequences, the question becomes unavoidable. What exactly is being hidden? And if the committee isn't allowed to know, how can the country trust this person with powers that surpass almost every other agency leader? But the momentary tension around his testimony was just one thread. Another, far more complex thread involved money. Money routed through offshore structures. Money connected to foreign entities. Money that raised eyebrows among national security experts. Reports suggested Patel was tied to investments that passed through the Cayman Islands and into companies linked to nations under close scrutiny by U.S. intelligence. Even the perception of such entanglements would be enough to disqualify most applicants from entry-level intelligence roles. And here was someone being considered to oversee the entire bureau. How does an FBI director investigate foreign interference while carrying financial ties, direct or indirect, to companies tied to those same foreign governments? How does someone lead counterintelligence while holding investments that could raise conflict of interest alarms inside the very divisions they oversee? These were not speculative concerns. These were documented portfolio details. And they were details no one requested more clarity on, except Whitehouse, who recognized the danger of leaving these questions unanswered. Yet, even these financial concerns were just another layer of a growing unease. Then the senator revealed the part that shook even seasoned observers: the warnings from Patel's own side. These were not political rivals. These were people who worked closely with him during the previous administration. One senior official described Patel as wholly unqualified. Another said his ideas were so reckless they bordered on dangerous. Another characterized his judgment as deeply flawed and his presence as a liability to national security. One national security official even threatened to resign if Patel were promoted into their division. And these were not fringe voices or distant observers. These were people who saw his work firsthand, sat beside him in meetings, watched how he handled intelligence, and walked away alarmed. These warnings weren't whispers. They were blunt assessments, delivered by people who had every reason to support him, but simply couldn't. And yet, somehow, those warnings had been brushed aside. Until now. But the most devastating assessment didn't come from officials. It came from a courtroom. A judge in Colorado, evaluating Patel's testimony under oath, concluded that it wasn't credible, that it lacked logic, that it lacked evidence. For any witness, such findings would be damaging. For someone aspiring to lead an institution where credibility is the foundation of every operation, every case, every agent's work, it was staggering. Whitehouse explained that when law enforcement witnesses are discredited in court, internal reviews normally follow. Accountability mechanisms engage. Questions are asked. But none of that happened here. Instead, the person who delivered testimony so unreliable that a judge had to formally discredit it was now being elevated to oversee the entire agency. The contradiction was impossible to ignore, yet it had gone unchallenged until Whitehouse forced the issue. From here, the senator connected everything into one warning, one that extended far beyond Patel himself. He pointed to patterns across institutions: the closure of corruption units, the weakening of financial crime tracking, the shift away from counterintelligence operations, and the internal proposals to dismantle the FBI divisions monitoring foreign influence. These weren't random moves. They formed a pattern, one that aligned perfectly with Patel's own stated goals: shutting down the intelligence branch, scattering personnel to field offices, scaling back oversight of foreign networks. Whitehouse described these proposals not as bureaucratic adjustments, but as structural disarmament. Because if you weaken the intelligence wing of the FBI, if you close the divisions that track illicit finance, if you push out career officials who specialize in counterintelligence, you're not just changing policy. You're removing the country's defense systems. Then came the geopolitical layer, the layer few wanted to discuss publicly. Whitehouse noted how foreign powers, particularly Russia, have a long history of exploiting weakened institutions, especially during leadership transitions. He explained how shutting down or hollowing out FBI intelligence units would open doors that adversaries have been trying to pry open for years. He pointed out that the kleptocracy units, which had successfully seized corrupt foreign assets, were already being dismantled by leadership shifts. Those units were responsible for tracking money linked to oligarchic networks and criminal syndicates abroad. Removing them didn't protect America. It exposed it. And it sent a message, one not lost on the countries whose assets those units had intercepted. When Patel's publicly stated plans overlapped so neatly with actions already taken in other agencies, the senator's warning took on new weight. Institutional vulnerabilities don't happen by accident, which brings us to the heart of his closing message. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He simply laid out the stakes in plain language. Leadership of federal law enforcement isn't just another appointment. It's a position that determines whether the nation's security systems function or fail, whether investigations unfold freely or get quietly redirected, whether corruption is exposed or protected. whether foreign influence is confronted or ignored, and whether federal agencies remain independent or become tools of loyalty. When someone with Patel's record, public threats, unreleased testimony, financial conflicts, discredited court statements, and warnings from his own colleagues, is placed in charge of an institution built entirely on trust and independence, the consequences aren't temporary. They're structural. They outlast elections. They reshape the agency's mission. They alter how intelligence is gathered, how corruption is traced, how justice is applied. Decisions made by one director can ripple through the system for decades. That was the senator's message. Not that a nominee was unqualified, but that the country was standing at a crossroads where institutions could be reshaped in ways that were hard to reverse. He warned that Patel's leadership wouldn't just influence policy, it could redefine the FBI's identity, strip away its safeguards, silence its truth-tellers, push out those who resist political pressure, and weaken the nation's defenses at a moment when foreign adversaries are using more sophisticated tactics than ever before. His speech wasn't a partisan attack. It was a call for vigilance, a reminder that public attention is the only barrier between strong institutions and unstable ones, the only barrier between accountability and abuse, the only barrier between oversight and blind loyalty. And his final warning was simple. When people stop watching, that's when institutions change without anyone noticing. That's when power reshapes itself in ways that the public only discovers years later. That's when consequences become irreversible. So, if this moment feels heavy, it's because it is. Hearings like this aren't political theater. They are safety valves. They are guardrails. They are the last checkpoint before power becomes permanent. And when the stakes involve national security, intelligence integrity, and the independence of the country's top investigative force, the cost of silence is too high to ignore. If you want more deep dive breakdowns, high-retention political analysis, and unfiltered explanations of the moments shaping the country right now, make sure you like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your engagement keeps this channel alive, keeps these stories visible, and ensures the truth stays louder than the noise. Stay alert, stay aware, and stay tuned, because the next chapter is already forming.